Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming along and welcome to the second Sustainability Seminar Series event of the year. I'm Louise Logan. I'm from King's Climate and Sustainability, and we're the team working to embed sustainability in everything that we do at King's. So today's seminar is titled Communicating Across Divides, and it's a dialogue for sustainability. And this is a collaboration between King's Academy, which is Kings's academic development department, and King's Climate Sustainability. And this seminar is quite different from our usual format. So instead of having our usual panel, we're going to have a dialogue, and we hope that that will help us, figure out how we can navigate contentious subjects and differences of opinion with empathy and understanding. Our facilitator today is Dr. Emma Taylor, who's a lecturer in education at King's Academy, and she's going to begin by explaining what a dialogue is in this context and how this session is going to be structured. But before I hand over to Emma, just some housekeeping. So all of your mics and cameras are off, which isn't ideal as we want you to be included in the dialogue. But this is the first time we've done one of these online, and we weren't really sure how it would work with everyone, raising hands and unmuting. So please bear with us, it's very much an experiment today. But instead, we're going to invite you to use Mentimeter and the meeting chat throughout so you can add your thoughts and comments. So we'll bring those in at the end. We'd really like everyone to get involved, add your thoughts, but just please remember to be respectful throughout. We also won't have a formal Q&A, so please do use the chat and the Mentimeter when prompted. Another reminder is that this seminar series is linked to the Keats Sustainability and Climate module, and that's a fully co-created interdisciplinary module that's open to all current King's staff and students. And it covers a lot of really big topics in sustainability, from climate change to food, sustainable finance, and social justice. So if you haven't enrolled yet, we'd really encourage you to check it out. And at the end of the session, we'll share a few links in the chat. So now I'm going to hand over to our facilitator for the day, Emma Taylor. Thanks, Emma.
Hi, thank you so much, Louise. Really great to see everybody here today. And yeah, as Louise said, this is an experiment really in seeing how this works, particularly online. So please do get involved as far as possible using the Menti or using the chat. This is really about hearing everyone's reflections on the question that we're going to be discussing today. So before we start, I think it's important to get to really kind of define what is meant by dialogue. So at King's Academy, along with my colleague Chris, who's here today, we're working on ways of supporting staff, how to manage difficult conversations in the classroom in the particular kind of geopolitical moment that we're faced with. And we've been looking at dialogue as one way, as a method of communication, one way of doing this. But what exactly is dialogue? So it's often referred to in higher education and beyond, but not often very clearly defined. And I have been trained in a specific method of dialogue. So if we wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, Louise. So this is the definition that I kind of use, but there are multiple different definitions that you might find. But it's essentially, in this context, a skillful way of talking and thinking together that tries to establish a common meaning amongst a group of people. So it doesn't necessarily mean, by common meaning, that doesn't mean agreement as such. It doesn't mean that we have to come out of today all agreeing with one another. But what it does mean is that we try to come out of today having some kind of shared understanding around the question that is being posed. And I think it's also helpful to understand what dialogue is by understanding what it isn't. So it isn't monologue, which is what I'm doing now, where one person dominates the conversation. So I'm going to ask the panelists to kind of be mindful of that as they're talking, and if they feel as if they might be moving into monologue, to kind of move against that if possible. And it's not debate where people are trying to win out. So one side is trying to win out, or you're trying to get across your viewpoint as a way of gaining points on another person or another team, as it were. So it's all about kind of respectful contributions in order to come to a shared understanding. And it does slow down the conversation a little bit, because some of the practices, which I'll go on to briefly introduce now, Louise, if that's okay to move to the next slide. some of the practices really revolve around this idea of respect. So providing space for understanding of other people's viewpoints, trying to bring your own voice into the conversation, speaking as authentically as possible, and then listening. So that's what slows things down, really. If you're really listening to others and their responses, that means before crafting your response, you listen. You're not crafting the response at the same time as listening, which can be quite difficult because we're all used to immediately responding to what we're hearing. So it does slow things down a little bit. So don't be surprised if the conversation is a bit slower than you might be used to. And then finally, suspension, which again relates to respect, but it's all about, and all four practices really are interconnected. But suspension ultimately is about suspending judgment. So before jumping to conclusions about what somebody else has said, just trying to understand, take a step back and thinking, right, why did they say that? Why is this making me feel this way? Can I maybe ask them to justify why they've come up with that particular viewpoint? Because dialogue isn't a space where anybody can say whatever they want. You have to be, when you come into a dialogue, you have to be willing to kind of justify the reasons why you think or perceive or have a certain viewpoint. What's the evidence, for example, in an academic setting for having that particular view on an issue? So we're going to start now. I'll just quickly go through the structure. And if anyone has any questions about this as we move through, I'll try and answer them if I can keep an eye on the chat as well as the dialogue. But every dialogue starts with a check-in. So we'll have a separate check-in for the audience and the panelists in a second. Then we'll spend about 45 minutes actually having the dialogue around question who leads the change in climate and sustainability policy, profit or personal responsibility. And then we'll have a checkout. And this is the checkout will be the same for everybody. So as we're moving through the dialogue, do think about things that come up that you might want to reflect on and take forward after the seminar today. So we're going to start with a check-in for the audience using the Mentimeter. So, and you can also, if you don't want to use Menti or you don't want to post in the chat, then please do just, feel free to check in yourselves, just in your own heads, as it were. So the question is, what change do we need to see to make progress towards a sustainable future? And we should start to see some ideas come up on the Menti now. We'll give you a few minutes to do that. This will also help the panelists potentially to if they wanted to pick up on anything that they see coming up in the Menti here. Interesting. All the words are getting smaller and smaller. Wow, and loads of different ideas and thoughts coming up here. Louise, have you got any comments or thoughts around any patterns that you can see?
Yeah, I think that these role is obviously a huge focus on education, which you probably expect from, a university seminar. But I like that a lot of it is really mindset, long-term thinking, but also systemic change. It seems really quite broad, which I think is kind of what we hoped for and will hopefully bring out quite an interesting discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we're going to move into the dialogue now. But I wonder if we firstly just move on to the reflection page for the Menti, Louise, if that would be okay, and we'll come back to that slide at the end. But we'll keep this page open. It won't be on the screen as the dialogue progresses, but we will keep this Menti open, and then we'll share it at the end. And also, if you wanted to put your reflections in the chat as well, that's fine if you prefer to use that. But we're really keen to get audience interaction too. So please do add your thoughts on and reflections on the dialogue as it progresses. Also gives us like a nice record of what was discussed too, and what your thoughts were as the panelists also comment on the question and get involved in the question. So what's going to happen now is we're going to stop sharing the screen, and we're going to move into the dialogue section of the seminar. I wonder, is it possible to pin the panelists, Aditi? Is that something that we can do?
Yeah, I think we can do that. So if you start, Emma, Aditi, and I can work on that in the background.
Okay, thank you. Right, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to go around each of the panelists for today and ask them to introduce themselves and give us just a brief overview as to what motivated them to take part in the dialogue today, before we then start discussing the question. So if we start with who's closest to me on the screen. So Franz, would it be possible to start with you?
Hello, my name is Franz Burkhardt. I work in the geography department. I'm a professor there, and I work on the environment and policy and climate change. What motivated me to get involved in this is, I suppose, twofold. One is that I work on issues of sustainability, and also within King's Climate and Sustainability, which is trying to lead a sort of transformation process within the university, but also from my interest in freedom of expression. And, you know, at the moment within the university, we're trying to think of ways in which we can equip people with confidence and skills to have dialogues which are civil but informed, and allow people to express the widest set of ideas that they may have. And so for both those reasons, I'm very interested in today. Thanks.
Thank you. And Chris?
Hello, everyone. I'm Chris. Emma's already mentioned I work with her in King's Academy, and I've been leading some work on freedom of speech and expression. But I've also been interested in climate education. I taught both in schools and universities about this, and worked on research projects around public perception of hydrogen technologies and how we might move things forwards, and ideas and how they kind of become embedded in society. So that's me.
Thank you, Chris. And then Hasnain, is that, can I see you?
Yep, correct.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really good to be here, and I'm really glad that we are having, I guess, the second academic dialogue that King's has held, with the first one being about AI, and that was sort of one of my main motivators of really getting involved in this. I do have two other reasons, and just a bit of background. So I'm the Vice President for Health with the Student Union. So my job is to obviously represent all students, and recently, just been involved with all the graduation ceremonies and delivering speeches on behalf of all the students there. So it's been really nice to see, the wider impact of our work. And the two other sort of reasons as to why I was motivated. Firstly, my sort of existing close work with the KCS department, especially with Franz, Louise, and wider colleagues, really working on some key initiatives and linking that to our work. For example, with the shuttle bus that we're looking to sort of introduce by September, and then also I undertook the carbon literacy training last year, which was an incredible sort of training opportunity, in which I learned a lot more about sort of the involvement and the role that we all play, sort of on an individual and also on a wider level, in terms of our impacts on the climate and the environment, but then also what we can do to help others achieve the same. So yeah, looking forward to this.
Thank you. And Harjeet?
Hi everyone, Harjeet Moore, Deputy Director for Inclusion, Belonging and Wellbeing here at King's. In terms of what interested me in this topic, it kind of stems from my previous role before King's. Worked for a quite a large catering company, and I was responsible for leading on net zero for my sector. So never done it before. And to be honest, nobody else wanted to do it. And I thought, why not? So it was a huge learning curve, but I absolutely loved it. So worked a lot on around reducing food waste, looking at carbon emissions, looking at kind of fork to farm, farm to fork. I always get that mixed up. So a lot around kind of that area. So when I kind of had the opportunity to kind of get involved here, I thought, why not? If anything, I'd like to be more, get a little bit more involved. It's just kind of just doing it is what I need to do. So yeah, that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Mark?
Yeah, I'm Mark Pennington. I'm a professor in the political economy department. I teach a course on ethics, economics, and environmental protection, and I'm running a research grant on market economies and green ideals. So for me, sustainability really requires that governments, private organizations, and we as individuals do not impose unwanted costs on other actors, unwanted environmental costs. But it also requires recognizing that those costs and the way that we might avoid them are often uncertain and subject to contestation. So whenever we have situations of uncertainty or contestation, we need reflexivity so we can learn from across different perspectives. And dialogue, it seems to me, is a central part of that reflexive process. So that's why I wanted to be involved in the event today.
Thank you so much. Gabrielle?
Hi, so I'm Gabby Samuel and I work at the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine in the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy. My background is ethics and sociology, and my research explores the ethical, social and regulatory issues associated with incorporating environmental harms as a consideration in health sector policy and practice. So I suppose my motivation is kind of obvious because most of my research revolves around questions of responsibility. I ask questions about what it means to be responsible for environmental impacts as individuals who work in the healthcare sector, but also patients more broadly who interact with the healthcare sector. And this includes looking at how discourses around environmental impacts are framed, and particularly how they're framed around individual responsibilities. And then also how that often masks the structural changes that are required to make the changes. And then when I talk about structural changes, I'm talking about issues of policy and profits. So I think that therefore kind of shows my motivation, because I just love having discussions about questions of responsibility, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Gabby. I remember that. And then Frances, please. Is Frances there?
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes. So I'm the founder and president of Kings for Change. It's a student society at King's, and it focuses on community organizing for change. So we're actually also working on the shuttle bus campaign and the rent guarantor campaign. And I'm an IIR student currently doing study abroad semester at Sciences Po. And so there was two main reasons for my motivation and research in this area. One is that in my course, I engaged with a lot of events in law and state affairs, and I found that environmental and like social sustainability was completely omitted from the conversation. Like it wasn't even something that we discussed at university events. And the other aspect of that is the flip side of responsibilities, the inequalities present in responses themselves. Like, are the responses adequately addressing the inequalities that we hope to, especially in North and South dynamics? And so I think this is a wonderful way to also engage students in debate and learning, because I think education is an access point for issues like this especially.
Thank you, Frances. Alia? Are you there, Alia? Thought I saw her earlier on. No, okay. Well, we'll move on to John, who I think is our final panelist, and then hopefully Alia will be able to join us. Thank you, John.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Owens. I'm a senior lecturer in ethics and public policy in the School of Education, Communication and Society. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here today, delighted to be talking to you all. So my interest is quite broad. I teach a module on what you might describe as critical environmental studies on the BA Social Sciences program. And my research at the moment is focusing on questions about environmental education and environmental justice. And I'm particularly interested in the role that education can play in developing, I guess, what we might describe as sort of critical forms of understanding of socio-ecological crisis, or whichever polycrisis you want to be talking about. It's very interesting to see on the Menti that people talking about the importance of mindsets and attitudes, these sorts of things. And yeah, I really think there is scope for education, for universities to do more to foster more sort of critical forms of understanding of the crisis, how we've got to this point, and where we would like to go next. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. I think that's all our panelists. I don't know if we could pin all the panelists on one page. That would be helpful for the dialogue purposes. If not, it's okay. But we'll get started. We'll get started now. Thank you so much to all the panelists for checking in and introducing themselves. What's going to happen now is we'll just get started with the dialogue. I wonder if also we could put the question in the chat. So the question that we're asking in this dialogue is, who leads the change, policy, profit, or personal responsibility? And what will happen is when panelists want to come in, they should feel free. You can put your hand up and I will invite you to come in. Normally in a dialogue, it would be much more fluid, but as we're kind of experimenting with this online, we'll see how it goes. And if we can move into a more fluid way of doing things, then fantastic. We've got such a great and broad panel here that I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And please do get involved, those of you in the audience, in the chat, or via the Menti. But we will, and if I might need to flag if we move it a bit too much into monologue or debate, or if we need to remember any of the practices, then I'll bring that forward. But my role is essentially just to monitor things and make sure everybody's getting the chance to speak if they want to. So we'll get going. I don't know if there's anyone who wants to start things off.
I'm happy to just start with a clarity question, which is, it'd be great to start by saying, what do we mean by change? So we could kind of explore that in terms of climate or sustainability, and also kind of thinking about the descriptive and the normative. So are you suggesting who leads the changes is what's happening at the moment, or what should happen? So a lot of my research looks at how individuals discourses often put the responsibility on to individuals, and that's where we saw on the Mentimeter this idea of education and about awareness and about this changing the mindset of what I assume as individuals to change their mindset about climate and sustainability, whereas we know that a lot of the issues around climate sustainability are socio-political issues, there are structural issues, and those often get masked when we think about those kind of more individual responsibilities. So it'd be really interesting to hear other people's thoughts, particularly because I heard some of you work in education, and I'm not saying that bottom-up education isn't important, but how you kind of consider that relationship between kind of bottom-up and top-down responsibilities in terms of those kind of more policy and profit, sectors.
Thank you, Gabby. Any thoughts or comments? Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I thought I'd pick up exactly on what Gabby said about, bottom up and education systems. The work that I mainly used to was when I was teaching in high schools was with students with, teenagers in the UK. And there was often, it was very much about here's what we should do, what's in the curriculum, let's think of ideas. But one of the things, and the Royal Society did a piece of work around this about 8 years ago. And they said it was great that there was this education out there and climate teaching in schools was wonderful. The problem was that students felt very powerless. They were thinking about very small scale things that were being talked about. The actions that were being shared that children could do and teenagers was either it was, oh, you need to solve this because the grown-ups don't know what to do, and maybe you will because you're the people kind of coming into this with fresh pairs of eyes and you're our hope for the future, versus this, we've got school teachers telling us to turn lights off when we go out into the room. And it was like, and we're just learning from like our science teachers how that is a minuscule comparison. And we'd talk about, you know, how cumulative effects might build up. But it was real, the Royal Society piece was how demoralizing teenagers felt, because it was like they were both being asked to solve something that they had no power in, and didn't think that the things that were being talked about in terms of actions and personal responsibility really fit anything that would actually lead to massive change. So it was a fascinating, if slightly traumatic piece to say education is really important. It does lead to things over time, but you still have to do things at bigger levels right now. We can't just hope that education leads to shifts over. So I was going to agree with Gabby kind of on that point, and say it's not really with the solution, but it is a massive problem and how we think about that.
Hasnain? Let's see.
Yeah, good. Yeah, thank you. No, good stuff. And that's exactly what I sort of wanted to come in and talk about as well, particularly when it came to sort of student empowerment and involvement. One thing that I've seen, especially in my work as well recently, was predominantly the sort of lack of, and I've put it here as well, the sort of lack of, I guess, maybe not even the lack, it was more so the downplay, if anything, actually, by leaders all around us from all three of the sort of segments in question: policy, profit, and personal responsibility. The downplay that we're all seeing in terms of, you know, being able to actually get involved with projects that are as important. Now, for example, I attended a national emergency briefing in Westminster about a couple of weeks back, which was specifically about the climate crisis. And you had celebrities, TV personalities, as well as various professors from KCL and Oxford and so on and so forth, who all came with the central message, which is that we need to act now. The government isn't really doing anything. And so, in particular, for the first part, you know, in terms of who leads the change, if you're looking from a policy perspective, you would imagine it's the government. You would imagine that we have sustainability leads, but we've got main key actors, I'd argue, from across the various different industries and sectors who fundamentally disagree with the way the government is handling things, you know. And just to give another point before, obviously, I don't want to make it into a monologue, but I think that real importance of authentic leadership, you know, like we're seeing a lot of stress on informing people, really sharing key messages, really, you know, going out there and demonstrating and showcasing that value. But at the same time, nothing's actually being acted upon. Nothing is actually being introduced to combat change. We're not seeing taxes on, for example, increased emissions. We're not seeing we're not seeing projects being redacted or taken away on stuff that is actually harmful for the environment or beyond. You know, so I think we need to see tangible action, and hopefully someone else, or, you know, any of the other panelists might have ideas on what that tangible action might look like.
Francis?
I'll try articulate this best I can, but I agree with Hassan that it's not just that the political will is there, but it's also what form and how will this action take place, and there's so many questions that need answering. But I also think the problem around the lack of action comes from a place of necessity. You know, I think we're quite insulated in the UK, and we have a lot of privileges, and I think action comes from a place of necessity, and maybe here more so from knowledge. You know, we see the success of poor countries, especially with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, like the bottom-up approach, community-led approaches that I think find a lot of success. And I also think that it's the programs that we do have, are they adequately addressing what we want them to? Like, I think of the World Food Programme in Somalia was one thing we studied in my course, how even though it was providing food to address issues of drought and famine, it wasn't adequately addressing, you know, their cycles of agriculture that allow them to sell and make profit locally. So I think it's finding the form that action takes and making sure that it's relevant and community focused as well is important.
Mark, do you want to comment? Thank you.
Yeah, I just have a slightly different take perhaps to some of the other contributors so far. So I very much understand the point about limits to individual responsibility. And I think it is important to recognize and to communicate to individuals that they can't address some of these problems on their own. But at the same time, I think it's important not to give the impression that there is some clear-cut alternative to individual responsibility. So when we talk about structural factors, there's a tendency for people to believe that it's easy somehow to reorganize a social structure or a social system to produce the outcome that you want. And actually, structural change, understanding what it should consist of and how it should proceed, is incredibly difficult to figure out. So it's important to keep that in mind, that this is one of the reasons why I prefer a kind of general language of incrementalism. You can have many small incremental changes that over time can lead to something quite substantial, rather than emphasizing the need for sort of revolutionary changes, which are often sort of impractical and in a sense make people feel disempowered, because it implies that you have to have a massive change before anything really can happen.
Thank you, Gabby.
I just wanted to come back to my point about responsibility, because I think one of the points which we're skirting over is, what if there is some responsibility at the individual level, what is that responsibility? So that it might be a responsibility to turn off the lights, which we see as problematic, as Christopher was kind of saying, but there is a responsibility to potentially, through advocacy, to kind of get change and kind of push governments or lobby. So there's various forms of different types of responsibility that can be enacted. So we could probably look at that. And the other thing I just wanted to say is, Mark, I totally agree with you. Like, structural change is incredibly complicated, and not just that, but there's lots of other responsibilities. Like, I have a responsibility to net zero, but also to feed my society and to also ensure that they're educated and they're looked after in terms of health. So how do you manage all of those different responsibilities? I think is incredibly difficult. But I think that there is an issue at the moment in terms of lobbying from fossil fuel, from big tech, from various that public-private, where responsibilities get a bit murky, that I think we could probably talk a little bit more about. Trying not to be a monologue, so I'll stop.
And Franz, and just to say before we carry on, that I know that because of this, the nature of this, feel free to kind of make a note and come back to a previous point that somebody's made. Like, it doesn't have to be sort of one point after another. That's absolutely fine to come back later on and reflect on something someone said in the process. So we'll go to Franz now. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. So I wanted just to get back to a couple of sort of first principles, which is to do with what are known as collective goods. So for instance, when we talk about the climate, we all contribute to climate change because we use energy, and we all also experience the effects of climate change in all sorts of direct and indirect ways, on hot days, but also on increased food prices, for instance, that we might be facing when we go shopping. And I think Mark started with this point. I mean, the reason why state action, so policy, actually is so important in thinking about sustainability is precisely because these things are collective goods, and therefore you need some kind of coordination, and that is the role of states, after all, some coordination of social action in relation to those kinds of threats, whether it is air pollution. The beginning of environmental policy in this country was really the Alkali Acts in the 1860s, had to do with hydrochloric acid emissions from factories, and all the way through to today, where we talk about climate change. So I guess I want to make a very strong plea for public policy actually addressing these kinds of issues in the first place. Now, obviously, there's a role for personal behavior, for private sector investment and so on, innovation, absolutely. But you have to start with the collective good nature of many of these things, and therefore you need some coordinating process, and governments and states are the ways of doing that. Now, obviously, people can be frustrated about whether that change is rapid enough, as Nain has articulated that, but nevertheless, I think that's usually where you need to start. Thanks.
Harjeet?
Hi, thank you. I was going to pick up a little bit more on some of the points that have been made earlier, but also what was in the word cloud. And particularly what kind of resonates is that education piece, moving more towards a long-term solution. If I look at it from a university perspective, and we try and look at things from a whole university perspective, it can sometimes feel a little bit of a short-term view. So it's just, I like the fact that when we talk about kind of like the leadership aspect in terms of, do we actually know what we mean when it comes to sustainability, climate change? And we've got people that will attend sessions like this that are passionate about the topic, but actually what about everybody else? And I think this is where, when we start to break it down in terms of being personally responsible, it's what can we do to kind of influence our peers, our colleagues and our teams to get more involved? And then also just kind of looking at it from the perspective that we seem to do a lot of things from a reactive point of view rather than shifting to that proactive piece. And for me, that's where that education piece comes in. Yeah, that's just kind of what I wanted to kind of mention.
John?
Yeah, thank you. Some really interesting comments so far. I'm just trying to pick up on a few of them, really, I think, and the question indeed. So I guess policy, profit, personal responsibility, you could add another kind of loose group of stakeholders. Protest, you think about the role of civil society and the role of activism in this, because individuals are not just consumers with responsibilities. They may take up political identities as citizens, engage in social movements through protest, that kind of thing. And I mean, I suppose like the question itself, if we think about what we mean by change or changes, I would suggest that we should be thinking about this in terms of a site of struggle. Like there isn't like a clear shared vision for what needs to happen. We've obviously got scientific data that we're working from. There may be recommendations attached to that, but there's a little agreement about the sorts of vision for the sort of socio-ecological vision we might want for the future. And so this is contested, and it's contested by these different stakeholders. So if you are asking, I don't know, businesses and corporations what a solution or progress or change might look like, ideally, that might look quite different from sorts of things which, I don't know, social activist groups, Just Stop Oil and BP would both have a story to tell about socio-ecological futures, but it would look very different. In the way that perhaps politicians, policymakers, the government, the opposition, there's plenty of debate and disagreement here. And so the point I want to make is, and without going into a monologue myself, that we should be thinking about this in terms of a site of contestation, where there is like not just sort of the technical details that we need to understand, the kind of scientific information, but we need better critical political literacy, I would suggest. And this is where the importance of critical thinking and education comes in. We need to be able to kind of deconstruct the discourses and the narratives that are coming from these different stakeholders. When corporations tell us that it's fine, we're leading the change towards a different type of decarbonized economy, then do we believe them? When politicians say that everything's in hand and we're moving towards a bright, sustainable future with economic growth and sustainability, do we believe them? When protesters are saying that this is what we need to do right now, we don't have time to think about anything else, do we believe them? And so developing a sort of sense of criticality, I think, is important, not just for understanding itself, but because of the way that understandings underpin agency. So what we can do as individuals, what we can be doing together, and the kinds of cases we would like to make to underpin the vision of change that we want.
Hasme.
Yeah, I was going to come in and actually pretty much say the exact same thing. There's one other thing, well, two things I wanted to mention very quickly. First, following on from Franz's point about sort of, government involvement and action. Whilst I do agree that this is pivotal and this is something that, is quite fundamental and should be the real sort of actor in this realm or in this sort of environment, I do believe that, we've got plenty of proof to suggest that the government isn't necessarily the strongest of actors right now. I mean, I know I keep drawing everyone's attention back to the sort of national briefing, but that was organized independently. right? And one of the biggest calls for that national emergency briefing is to ensure that the government actually listens and tries to, first of all, televise the whole screening and makes it very clear that this is something that we all need to seriously be thinking about, you know. So and again, I think this also follows from John's point about protest action and sort of, you know, wider demonstration. Well, this is an example of that, right? And I think it's really important that we all remember that not only is there a personal responsibility, but somebody else mentioned in the chat about a community and sort of, I think it was Iwa, who mentioned that there's communities and, you know, more than just, you know, personal. It's about people who come together to feel responsible, and I think that is a very strong sort of standpoint in which we should all be thinking about. And then my second point was what going off of what Ben mentioned about morality, equity, and justice, and how I think not only does that all fit quite nicely as a whole drive of itself, but also individually those three aspects as well. They do inform everything that we're trying to discuss in this dialogue about policy. Is policy morally effective? Is it equal? You know, does everybody have equal rights and equal access to the various interventions and structures that we are seeing? But then also, does it bring justice? You know, and bringing justice, I guess, isn't just a responsibility on law or on government, but it's for all of us, particularly when it comes to, for example, now within KCLSU, we've got our own campaign on fossil-free careers. The whole point of it is to bring justice to, you know, to our student body, but then also to future employers and allowing them to encourage people to act responsibly and act you know, with the environment and with the climate in mind. So there are various ways in which justice obviously manifests itself, and I think it's up to us, especially as leaders of now and the future, to really look at what we can do and how we go about informing that, which I think somebody else mentioned as well earlier.
Thank you, Hasnain. And Alia, I think we missed out. I couldn't see you in the introductions bit, so apologies. Would you mind just saying
sorry.
your...
Yeah,
No,
that
it's
was
fine.
just my Wi-Fi completely crashed. Yeah, I'm Alia. I'm a third year human geography student. I'm doing my dissertation on a very similar topic. I'm so sorry I missed the introductions. I just wanted to hop onto the comment about personal and collective action and responsibility. There are a couple really good case studies of where that action is really impactful. So I was going back to Starbucks, which is linked to, at the present moment, the Gaza genocide, but it's also can be easily and very tangibly linked to the emissions associated with conflict. So communal action has actually decreased Starbucks revenue by 11 billion since 2023, which is a stark example of where community action can have very tangible impacts on profit, for example. And then another one is that I think Shein has in the last couple of years been named the biggest fast fashion polluter in the world, and 50% of their buyers are Generation Z, so our generation, or my generation, sorry. And that's a huge example of where our purchasing power, especially, it directly contributes to emissions in so many different ways, and lots of other issues as well, conflict, which then also has a very cyclical relationship with emissions. So those are some really good examples of issues that I think the others have all said are so important. But I wanted to also highlight that as tangible and monetarily valuable as those actions are, it's been proven in a lot of research that personal or individual impact actually has a limit of about 10% on the global scale. The rest of that's 90% is a mix of policy and corporations. Actually, 100 corporations contribute 70% of emissions. So it's our purchasing power directly impacts those without profit, those corporations, but still they have the majority of the emissions directly linked to them. It can be scope 1, which is like direct emissions to them. Another really interesting, complicated nuance is that there's scope 2, scope 3 emissions, where they're the source of those emissions, but the direct emission actually goes back to the consumers again. So that's us again. So there's just a lot of very difficult, complex relationships around emissions and that personal or individual impact, but I think it's really mixed up in profit. But yeah, I'm looking forward to hear the others. I'm so sorry I missed the beginning. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I was thinking about what John had said that was around elements of, like, say, almost like scientific literacy is what I sometimes come back to in thinking about this kind of question of not necessarily kind of like who leads this change from these particular areas, but what might have stopped some changes being made, or what has kind of gotten in the way of some things, and then thinking about shifting political support, how often then things are sort of like, well, how do winds kind of like move throughout society? I often came back to say like the messaging during the pandemic about how the government was very on top of kind of getting out messages around the importance of kind of why certain decisions were being made. And there are lots of areas with quite crucial decisions that a government, say, could make and could put out that very rarely very publicly defend or justify something to say, irrespective of how popular this is going to be or not, this is why this action is going to take place. But how do you do that without being too preachy, without sounding too condescending to groups of adults? Finding that balance can be exhausting, but still incredibly important to always try to very patiently kind of get these out there. But I do think that throughout this, it's sort of assumed that the public is all kind of on the same page and understanding lots of things. There are very rarely kind of huge messages. It's just sort of out there, and then within the media too, kind of like dissect, and that's where then other narratives can come in. So it would be great to see sort of like those kind of, not necessarily campaigns, but something to support things kind of with the messaging around that and how that takes place.
Mark?
Sorry, yeah, I forgot the mute. Yeah, I wanted to comment on something that John said and that Hasnain said, maybe linking them together to think about things in a slightly different way. So John emphasized the importance of contestation at multiple levels, the idea of there being very conflicting views. And then Hasnain was referring to the importance of justice in these situations. And I think this raises a really interesting question, because you could argue that there's going to be a great deal of contestation about what is justice. You know, political philosophers don't agree on what is social justice or what it consists of. So if political philosophers don't agree about it, there's no earthly reason we would expect general members of the public to agree on what social justice consists of. So if you have disagreement about social justice, then it could be that you should push questions of justice aside if you want to get action on things like climate or other aspects of sustainability. You might need to give reasons people to act, even though they disagree about justice. Because if you wait for them to agree about what is just, you may never get any action.
Thank you. Hasnain?
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark, because that's actually exactly what I was just putting in the chat, which was, it's true. Like, there is this sort of disenfranchisement, right? That I think, at least from my perspective, that I'm seeing, which is that you have, experts and sort of professionals, particularly when we're talking about sort of responsibility and what social change would look like. We have people saying, oh, social change should be like this, or social change should be like that, or, there are certain things that we can do to achieve social change. But I think more so than the sort of end outcome, it's about what are we doing right now, the journey to actual change, right? And I think that journey is something that we can all inform and come together. And that's where we bring in the sort of community aspect, you bring in the sort of personal responsibility aspect, you bring in the policy aspect, and it's the journey that then defines that path of what we want to achieve. Now, for example, if the goal was net zero, well, we all have a role to play in that. For example, now Haji has mentioned, she's worked with reducing food waste before. That's a very crucial step in achieving net zero. Reducing carbon emissions is, can manifest in many different ways. And so there are different ways in which we get involved and we all travel on the same path, if that makes sense. But then reaching the end is, at least from my perspective, what a lot of people focus on, rather than seeing what we can actually do right now. And I think that's fundamentally where we're going to see this change, and also who's going to lead that change. Because especially when it comes to leaders as well, a lot of them are focused on achieving targets, right? We have to achieve net zero by this year, or we have to go and sort this initiative out by this time. But right now, it's sort of, it looks as if everything's just being postponed or delayed. And even if we're looking from a sort of empirical or time basis, there isn't actually anything happening in terms of encouraging that change. You might, offer grants for private companies, for example, to go and install solar panels on houses. But then does that actually mean that people are going to take that up? Because what if they think that solar panels are going to destroy their roofs, for example, which is in some cases a very big misconception, and that solar panels, they take up a lot of other resources. So I think there is an element of who's informing that journey to, let's say, net zero or carbon efficiency, and most importantly, who's leading the change for that as well. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. If it doesn't, then just say in the chat.
Thank you. Thanks for coming back to the question as well, and thanks to Gabby for also getting involved in the chat dialogue too. We've got, and it seems like that's where the audience are coming in. So great. Please feel free to just contribute to the dialogue as we go via the chat, if you would like. Where are we? John, we want to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating discussion. I think Mark's right, of course, that justice, social justice is contested. It's, it's like part of the challenge of politics is getting people with different views, different values, different agendas to try and agree. That might not be easy at all. Social justice is contested, but environmental justice is also contested, right? People disagree about what that means. Often we have very anthropocentric views about environmental justice, environmental concerns as being about human beings, but like an environmental justice that doesn't take into account other species, other ecosystems, the planet as a whole, seem like they might be lacking. And so there are all these trade-offs which are inherently political, right? Decarbonizing our economy seems like a priority. Would it be okay, therefore, to cover the Sahara Desert in solar panels, and to put a massive hydro station across the Bristol Channel if that's going to generate renewable energy but completely destroy these ecosystems and wildernesses? I mean, these are questions in part of justice. So, and I would say that these questions are sort of an inherent part of the challenge that we face when thinking about the change towards sustainability from the moment we're in. And just to come back to this point about education and Chris's point, of course we need the scientific literacy, but I think we also need the political literacy as well. We need to understand much better what we mean when we talk about environmental justice. It just isn't taught in schools and universities. So explicitly in England, the Department for Education have ruled out the teaching of environmental education and climate change in a way which brings in what they describe as extreme political positions. So you can talk about the technical causes of climate change in terms of greenhouse gases, for example, but you can't, for example, talk about the history of colonialism and capitalism over the last 500 to 600 years, which have produced this situation, which led to industrialization, which led to emissions. You can't really talk about like the ways in which, I don't know, campaigning groups who might be seeking to advocate for alternatives to these systems, these political economic systems, might bringing those into a classroom would be to go against the statutory guidance. So that's in schools, but we can ask ourselves in universities, to what extent are we willing and able to introduce more critical forms of environmental education? If we stick to the sorts of dominant paradigms of environmental education around sustainability, sustainable development, these are largely developed in line with the sorts of neoliberal kind of technocratic thinking that have kind of prevented like attention to the more difficult political questions of justice and responsibility. So this is a challenge, I think, for all of us. Like, can we develop the political literacy alongside the scientific literacy to help us really engage with these very complex questions?
Alia?
Yeah, just developing on some of John's points, but also going off of Mark's. I absolutely agree that conceptual misunderstandings about justice, social justice, environmental justice can delay action, but I definitely disagree that it should be sidelined, because climate action and sustainability are inherently long-term processes. And if you were to look at, oh, the climate crisis is so imminent, we need to put this to the side and focus on action, that would be detrimental in the future. And I think there's two mechanisms that would happen across, and that's developed countries or the global north versus the global south, and developing countries, low-income island nations, for example. If you were to sideline justice in terms of, you could say justice in terms of who makes the rules, who enforces the policies, who creates the policies. If we were to sideline that, that would have a detrimental impact on social sustainability, I believe. And environmental sustainability and social sustainability are two sides of the same coin. They in so many complex ways affect each other. If you were to sideline justice, you would be sidelining social sustainability in a large respect, I would say. And in many ways, and in the future, that would be to the detriment of environmental sustainability. I would also say that if you were to sideline justice, you would be sidelining, I think, low-income communities in any nation. For example, sustainable options are still highly inaccessible and inaffordable, inaccessible. So to sideline justice in that way, because we haven't all got the same understanding, would be to the detriment of a large proportion of our nation and other nations, I think. I'm sure you believe in justice. I don't think that's what you were saying. I just think that conceptual academics, concepts, terms, they get very confusing, and they get muddled in the general population's understanding of complex crises like the environmental crises. So when it comes to action or understanding, it's very difficult, but I think it should be as much as possible embedded throughout the entire process, including now, if that makes sense.
Franz?
I'm going to continue banging on as the one statist here. I mean, I also want to just slightly deflect the gloom that exists, because of course there is a lot of change going on. I mean, most of it is not because of changes in personal behavior, but as I say again, about public policy. So let me just give you a very simple example. So at King's, since 2018, 2019, we've reduced our scope 1, scope 2 emissions by about 20 to 21%. Almost the entire reason for that has to do with the decarbonisation of the electricity system. I mean, we've done some things in terms of our own estate, but as you know, our buildings are pretty old, and they're difficult to insulate, and replacing gas boilers is also something that happens periodically, but is a slow thing and over a long period of time. Now, so it was government policy that has led to the penetration, particularly of renewables. Wind is particularly important, but also increasingly solar. Really substantial reductions in carbon emissions in the UK power system. And just to give you another example, last week, the government completed an auction of offshore wind licenses for about 8 gigawatts of power in the North Sea, sufficient to power about 12 million homes. Now, these new wind turbines will be operating sometime by 2030. Again, government action in the background, something we pay for, of course, through our electricity bills, but we don't need to do anything more than allow the system to be completely transformed. And I think actually those are the really big transitions which are happening. Electric vehicles on the streets of London, about 25% of cars bought in the UK last year were electric vehicles, entirely due to government policy supporting all of that. The subsidies on these cars, these vehicles, which are slightly more. I myself bought an EV last year as a result of all of this. So I think we mustn't forget that there's a lot of really important change going on, and the deep changes in our economies are actually going on as a result of government policies.
Thank you, Franz. And Mark?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask John. John used the term technocratic. What does he understand by the term technocratic? What does that mean?
John, feel free to come in here.
Well, I suppose if we think about like a particular context. So imagining like environmental education, climate change education in schools, like where does that take place across the curriculum? Predominantly, I suppose, environmental education, climate education takes place in like the science curriculum, or maybe in the physical geography curriculum, so somewhere like that. But it probably wouldn't take place in English literature, for example, or maybe in art. Obviously, that depends on pedagogy. It depends on the way like education operates in a particular institution. But I guess the technocratic elements would be those which are more based around facts, evidence, oriented towards engineering and technology, that sort of thing, rather than thinking about, I don't know, ethical or cultural or historical questions, those to do with questions about responsibility or justice, those to do with power. Now, obviously, like there's a few sort of distinctions being made, which might be kind of, we might think there are some gray areas here. We might look to other alternative forms of pedagogy and practice, but like it's those sorts of ideas I have in mind, if that makes sense, Mark.
Did you want to reflect on that at all, Mark? Or
no, not on that point. I had just one more point I wanted to raise to Alia, just to try to explain my previous point a little bit more, if that's okay.
Of course.
So yeah, so I am actually very skeptical about the idea of justice. Or what people mean by justice. So I think when we speak about justice, really, in my view, we're looking at the institutions that are required to deal with the fact that there's often deep level moral disagreement in our societies. So questions of justice are actually about how people who fundamentally disagree can nonetheless find a way to coexist. So when I say in the context of something like climate change, you might want to abandon justice, it doesn't mean that you avoid, for example, the possibility of redistributed payments. It could require that certain countries give money to others, not because they think it's just, but because they think it's the only thing that's going to deliver some kind of action. So that's what I mean by putting justice out of the way. If you focus too much on moral level agreements about what is just, what is ethical, then you often actually prevent actions which would be considered beneficial across many different parties who may disagree about these fundamental moral questions. That's the point I'm making.
Interesting. We'll go. Yeah, Alia, if you quickly respond, and then we'll go to Francis. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Sure. Just quickly. Okay, that makes sense. I do agree in certain ways. I would just highlight that I think a lot of support for climate change will be have a moral basis. So I think it will be founded in people's personal experiences and why their lives are like, we don't see it in the UK yet, especially, but why people's lives are fundamentally at risk and damaged and ruined by climate change will be a moral basis for basically either changing their actions or informing political policy change, or even profits to go in a more sustainable direction. So I think that moral disagreement, I think people disagree about everything. It can delay action, of course, but I think if there's a large consensus, which there definitely is, and it's only going to grow, then that moral basis will only push climate change action further. That's what I believe.
Thank you, Alia. I'm just looking at time. It's gone very quickly, and thank you all for sticking with the spirit of dialogue. I think it's, you've really, thank you, really appreciate that. But I think what we'll do is we'll have the three, we'll have Francis, Gabby, and John, and then we'll see where we're at in terms of time before we move into the checkout. Francis, would you like to make?
I just wanted to go off what Mark and Alia were discussing about justice and whether responsibility and who's driving change has a moral basis. And I think it really does, because it's about what works for each individual community and nation. And there's an academic called Hamilton who speaks around the dangers of homogenizing culpability. There's this big idea around we need to create change, but in doing so, this also implies a denial of local practices, cultures, languages, histories, because there's an inequality in historically who is responsible, and it's often been attributed to enhancing issues of colonial legacies and that of violence and terror, and enhancing, exacerbating issues of nationalism as well. So this planetary we, I believe, isolates developing countries even more from wanting to become part of that we. But then also the other part of what John first mentioned around the Anthropocene, he introduced that concept, is, we're in the first era where there's a possibility of a man-made extinction. Like, we've never had this in Earth's history where humans are responsible. So I think it's normal to have a lot of confusion and disparity around humans securitizing ourselves from ourselves. Like, that's a really funny concept to wrap our heads around. And I think we're in the space between learning and knowing what works. So I think also taking what we individually and systematically know works and trial and error as well. But I do think that climate change action does have a moral basis, because despite calls for a planetary we and collective action, that doesn't work, and it's historically incorrect and inequitable as well.
Gabby?
I just wanted to respond to a couple of things. So Franz was talking about decarbonisation, and it made me think about change for what. So it's great that we can decarbonise, it's great that we're moving to renewables, but then what do we do when we hit net zero? And what about the exploitative practices that are kind of being developed in many of the countries that are developing our solar panels and all of our wind farms? And there's a huge number of kind of like justice issues and exploitative practices, if we're thinking about sustainability, that happens there. So I think we just need to be careful around this. And then then we need to think about the climate crisis as a social justice crisis, rather than kind of, it's not just a geological crisis, but it's a crisis in the way that we're treating the world and the people within it. So that was one reflection there. I think some of the chat that we were talking about, some of the things we were talking about in the chat was around communities, and I think there's, although I don't think it's necessarily responsibility of communities, but this idea of individual modes of resistance in neoliberal capitalist societies to show what it looks like to do something well. So decathlon is a really nice example of a sustainable practice or business that I think we can draw on, where it might not be a responsibility, but we do have the power to show how things can look better. And then I wanted to reflect on the morality thing, because I mean, I'm an ethicist, and I would argue that everything has to be grounded in decisions of morality. I understand the need to be practical, and I understand the problems with conflicts around morality and how we can come to resolution. But in any decision making, there needs to be some moral justification about why we should do things. At the same time, I've done some research, actually it was a student that helped, looking at how animal research ethics got institutionalized. Because obviously the morality around animal research, animal ethics has been going on for centuries and centuries and centuries. And it was never a shift in morality that led to it being institutionalized, but it was because of the increase in bottom-up political actions by communities on top of the top-down institutions from universities and public policy and legalities that led to that change. It wasn't the morality that suddenly switched in consumer decision making, but it was that kind of politics bottom up and then the top down and the advocacy. Finally, very, very quickly, because I know I'm on a monologue, electric cars are really problematic. They are not green. They have embodied emissions. They have all sorts of other emissions, and we should be putting money into public transport and infrastructure rather than individualizing transport through electric cars. I'm stopping.
Thank you, Gabby, and thanks again for summarising some of the conversation that was happening in the chat and for monitoring that too. Much appreciated. John.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to be brief. Mark, I don't think I disagree with the things that you're saying about the need for sort of institutions to work to support forms of justice through procedures and all the rest of it. But I think I would sort of, I guess, echoing Gabby, sort of try to insist on a much broader conception of justice, which isn't simply procedural, but it's or about redistribution. It's also about recognition, and it's about representation, and really opening up questions about, well, for example, what would be of benefit to whom Who do we count as subjects of moral concern? How do we try to negotiate between the interests of different groups? And expanding recognition beyond, the kind of typical focus on human beings, in particular human beings, maybe human beings in, elite positions or in particular countries or nations, to all human beings, more than human beings, so animals, ecosystems, and the planet. None of this is easy, but these are the difficult conversations that I think we need, and we are beginning to see in certain quarters, but they're sort of largely isolated, I think, to those who are interested in having them. So part of the challenge is how do you develop greater engagement with the social, the political, and the ethical dimensions of the crisis? And indeed, what kind of crisis do we think we're in? Because, Franz, you're completely right that we have made progress around things like estates and emissions in places like King's, right? But when it comes to, I don't know, like teaching culture or pedagogy or the curriculum, like what is it that we are teaching here? To what extent are we able to sort of bring in these difficult social, political, and ethical questions into our teaching, which challenge some of our existing forms of knowledge and culture in the institution? How do we get, for example, our economics department to think beyond neoclassical economics and really take seriously, some of the heterodox positions which might challenge some of the fundamentals around growth? I mean, that's a political imperative at the moment. Anyone like talking against the growth agenda looks like they're barking up the wrong tree, and yet we all know that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, right? So these difficult questions, they won't go away, they will become more intense. But these are the challenges that we face, and I think as an institution, these are the sorts of challenges that King's should be embracing.
Thank you, John. And then Hasnain, I think we'll finish with you, although you will get the chance to reflect on what you've heard. And if there's something that you wanted to say in response to a point that's been posed, then please do use that opportunity at the end to also do that. Hasnain, go for it.
Sure thing. Thank you, Emma. I actually wanted to sort of not echo, but necessarily sort of reiterate Gabrielle's message on people being responsible rather than being just responsible. And I think that's a very, very key thing that I think all of us have touched on here. Like throughout everything that everyone's discussed, I've noticed that we've talked about who can actually do things, who can actually say things, who's actually leading the change. If we look at King's, for example, which obviously Franz has mentioned, we have, wherever we can, tried to implement stuff, and we're still doing so. But that responsibility doesn't just lie on, for example, the climate team or Franz himself or anyone. It relies on all of us being able to input into that process, being able to actually speak about that further, being able to discuss the work that we're doing further. So you've got all of that on a King's perspective. And then one thing that I mentioned in my graduation speeches that I've just given is this concept of us leaving the classrooms at King's and the classrooms of the world, because we see everything around us, right? And we're constantly learning, or you'd like to think that one constantly learns from everything around us. In many cases, that isn't the case. People don't learn from what they're seeing. And some people unfortunately seem to think that responsibility doesn't necessarily fall on them because of the pure fact that they're not responsible, as in they're not actually able to fulfill that responsibility or directly sort of get involved with that responsibility. So there is definitely a sense of how much capacity or what the capacity of an individual looks like when dealing with that responsibility, but then also the capacity of us sharing that with everybody on that journey I was talking about earlier, right? That whole point of everybody coming together. And I know it is very sort of optimistic, or you'd like to think it's very idealistic, everybody would be together, everybody can reach a certain target, and we'd all be involved like a happy family. But unfortunately, the systems and structures around us aren't necessarily accommodating for that. And I think us, especially as thought leaders and people who have worked in various industries over such a multitude of time, we really should be looking into, how we can actually change that. And I mean, Rose has put that in the chat, right? So could we change the systems? Honestly, I don't have the answer for that. I mean, I'm still too young. I'm 22. I've barely seen anything really. But at the same time, I would like to think that existing structures would help to accommodate for that. Do they? Right now they don't, but I think there is definitely hope, and that's what we need to work out, what that hope actually looks like.
Thank you. Nice to sort of end on that positive kind of note, I suppose. But what we'll do now is we're going to move into the check-in. Again, thanks so much for staying in the spirit of the dialogue. I know it's a bit stilting with me having, normally what would happen is we would just be able to speak freely and we wouldn't have this like but I just think for the purposes of ensuring we're not talking over each other online, this works. But interested in your feedback if we were to do this again. I wonder if I could bring in Harjeet now, just to start the check-out process, which is ultimately if there's something that you want to take forward and reflect on from today, if there was anything specific that kind of sprung to mind that you want to reflect further on as a result. And then we're going to go around and I'll ask the rest of the panelists to kind of contribute their own like final thoughts, I suppose. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the bit that I've looked at is around the social justice element, and keep going back to the initial question around, you know, who's responsible for profit and kind of policy and what I can do personally. So if I break it down into kind of like from a policy perspective, it's there to protect our rights. So from a university perspective, we make sure everything's kind of compliant. I think profit should be used to increase access. And then from personal responsibility, it's all about equity and participation. So I think if we kind of, in my mind, if I'm breaking it down into kind of those elements, it kind of fits. And I think that's where, from my role perspective here, is where I can try and influence and break it down a little bit more. So they're kind of some of the key bits that I'll be taking away from this.
Thank you so much. And yeah, nice to relate it practically to what you can do in your role at the institution moving forward as well. Thank you. Let's go to Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I think I'd probably reflect on something that what Franz was talking about, which is about not to underestimate the successes that there are within then initiatives that go through. And while I did start by saying, you know, sometimes teenagers throughout this can feel quite hopeless, there are some things that actually, as part of how we talk about this, shouldn't just be us having these sorts of like duets, but also pointing to really kind of like to initiatives and to things that are successful that we can do, to look at where we have been positive and successful in changing people's minds, in getting things working and in getting things going, to understand and learn from those so that we can do more of that.
Thanks, Chris. John? I'm just going around the screen as I can see you. So.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the this dialogue. This conversation has been really interesting. I thought I'd pick up on what Hasnain was saying about hope, because I think that's really important. I mean, it's easy to lose hope, I think, and to feel like there is a lot of doom in the conversation, but I think there's a lot of interest and a lot of activity. There's lots of things that are already going on. Hope isn't something that you sort of passively kind of wait for something to change to happen, right? Hope should be an active thing where we are all contributing what we can to try and achieve something which might be difficult in the circumstances, but is worth doing. And I think it is worth, as Franz has done, pointing to the successes, the things that we are doing at King's. It's, you know, to his credit and to his colleagues' credit that sustainability is being embedded across our undergraduate programs. That's a real achievement, and that will give us something to work with and through that. I mean, that's literally a space for negotiation of these difficult questions to happen. But I think we should be ambitious and we should be sort of expansive in our attempts to grapple with these things. And again, like, I think critical thinking and fostering the kind of political and ethical literacy, as well as the scientific literacy, is really, really important.
Thanks, John. Mark?
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on the point about disagreement, because in a way it's what I've enjoyed most about this afternoon is that there is actually a diversity of perspectives, and we shouldn't see the disagreement as a kind of negative thing. So I have to confess, if I come out of the closet, I'm a postmodernist. I don't believe in consensus. I believe there's joy in dissensus. It's actually through dissensus that you learn. And I think that's true in climate and sustainability as much as in anything else. So we shouldn't see evidence of disagreement wherever it is as a bad thing. We should kind of learn to live with it, and if anything, enjoy it and celebrate it.
Yes, thank you. And I think that's why I think the principles of dialogue can be effective in that they enable a space where people who disagree can come together without needing to come to a common agreement at the end of it. So it allows us to hear this diversity of views without the need to kind of come to the solution at the end of the dialogue. But thank you, Mark. Alia?
Yeah, I've enjoyed it so much. I've taken a lot. I think maybe a key takeaway would, I came into it knowing, but you can always develop on your understanding that it's a very complex issue. I think I've learned a lot more about balancing the environmental with the sustainability aspects of this whole issue. I've liked hearing professors explain the balance between action and practicalities with I guess moral justice, but like the really human foundations of any crises. But this fundamentally is about how we tackle this crisis. So I think the balance between what is the crisis, environmental, justice, moral, and how we go forward and balancing that together in the most productive way because it is so imminent. I've learned a lot and yeah, it's been a really good discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Gabby?
I'm going to keep this really short because I'm coming to the end. I like the fact that other people talked about hope and the successes, because I always forget about that. I'm such a critical scholar, so thanks for raising that as like the key take home. But I really, well, I think for me personally as an academic who thinks about responsibilities, I really want to talk to Mark some more about this idea of ethics not being the foundation for action, because I think there's something really interesting in terms of disagreements that we could have a conversation more about in terms of what does that mean in practice, what would it look like, and what are the benefits and cons of kind of going both ways. So I think there's something really interesting there.
Great that there might be ongoing discussions as a result of this too. Hasnain?
Yeah, firstly, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone. I feel like, not only did we have a conversation, but we actually interacted and engaged with each other. And it's, drawing from like the experience of the first dialogue that we had about AI, that it wasn't necessarily a large turnout, but everybody was incredibly engaged. And it was really good to see that, that we were able to foster that in this talk as well. And this audience was far, far bigger. I'll say that as well. I think one aspect that I will definitely be taking forward is that whole concept of being response able and actually encouraging people to be, sort of response able as well. So thanks, Gabby, for that. But I must say, like, it is an incredibly important, not even principle, it's more so a virtue, but also some, I guess, a notion of discussion and for future action. I definitely do believe, especially, being in the student union, that the whole point of our work is supposed to be encouraging co-creation, encouraging people to get involved, encouraging students to take action, encouraging students to really make KCL and KCLSU obviously their home and their platform to speak on. And not for us as leads of the student union to just speak for them. And I think being involved in dialogues like this and having that sort of fostered engagement is critical. It's absolutely essential to achieving that. So yeah, that's me. And just want to say a huge thank you once again to Emma, Louise, and the wider teams as well for facilitating this. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Francis.
Yes, thank you very much for everyone attending and for facilitating this event as well. One aspect that I think I'll take away from this dialogue was sort of Mark's perspective on the moral underpinnings of climate change action, but sort of my take on it is that even though this has been an incredibly productive dialogue, I think more action and less discussion is needed. We're in a learning process and it's trial and error. And so definitely in my position in Kings for Change in the uni, I think it will be about mobilizing responsibly able students, like offering opportunities to engage and sort of creating networks ourselves. Like, this is a community that we've created here, a little node in a network. So just helping to facilitate that in the university through events as well. But yeah, it was a wonderful event. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then France, we've got 5 minutes left in our meeting.
Well, I'm not going to take 5 minutes. Look, thanks a lot. So what struck me was the right at the beginning, the term empowerment and the great discussions about activism as well, and how people feel that personal responsibility is actually a really core part of this. And of course, what we're trying to do in, King's Climate and Sustainability and throughout the university, I think, is to get people, get students and staff involved more in these kinds of issues. So it's great that people were here. And thank you so much for the discussion and the different perspectives. I suppose on a slightly, developmental note, let me call it that, it would be great, I think, if in the future these dialogues could be slightly broader than just between the panel members. And if we could find out ways, rather than just through the chat, of involving, the participants who are sort of observing the dialogue. And I don't know how we could do that, so make it more inclusive. I think that would be really interesting if we could think about doing that. And then I think everyone would leave the room having said something, having been heard, and having been, a part of the conversation, which I think is probably what we're trying to do here. But great event, and thank you so much for organising it.